All right, well, welcome everyone to the National Association of State Energy Officials webinar on advancing a carbon dioxide transport network in the United States. My name is Kelsey Jones, and I'm a program director with the electricity team here at NASEO. And so we really thought this would be a pertinent subject to share with all of the state energy offices, with more carbon management technologies getting deployed across the country. The need for a more robust transport network will be needed to bring captured CO2 to end users and sequestration sites. And, states are looking to deploy more pipelines, but this is hampered by a few different factors related to the regulatory landscape, pushback from communities and landowners, and cost and affordability. So this webinar we really see as an opportunity for state energy offices to hear directly from three individuals with expertise on this topic. They come from the federal government, the nonprofit sector, and industry. And this webinar is part of a series of educational briefings on different carbon management related topics that NASEO is organizing in partnership with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. So just wanted to quickly say thank you to DOE for their support of NASEO, the state energy offices, and this webinar. So for some brief logistics, this webinar will be recorded and the slides and recording will be shared with all the participants and posted on the NASEO website. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you all to add any questions to the Q&A feature, and we will plan to address those following the presentations. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our three speakers. We'll be kicked off by Robert Smith, Carbon Transport Program Manager with the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management at DOE, followed by Ryan Kammer, Research Manager, Carbon Management with the Great Plains Institute, and then Nicholas Medina, the Public and Stakeholder Engagement Manager with ExxonMobil Pipeline Company, will wrap us up. So with that, I will turn it over to Robert to walk through his presentation.
Sure, and Kelsey, appreciate the opportunity to present to you and everyone else here today. So good day to everybody. I'm going to go off camera so you can focus on the slides and not on me. How's that? So next slide, please. This is our standard Department of Energy disclaimer. So I'm not going to read it other than, my voice here today doesn't fully represent the department and the discussions aren't binding. So if you can go to the next slide. So, investing in the carbon management value chain, I think we all agree is essential for meeting climate goals. This is because, decades of DOE and private investments have enabled commercial liftoff for capture and storage activities. However, a focus on transport and on policy development, private investment, and effective collaboration is still really needed to unlock carbon management's full potential. Next slide. All transport options like rail, ship, barge, truck, and pipelines will play a role in this idea of carbon management. They really need to expand significantly their networks to fit both local, regional, and national strategies. There's definitely not a one-size-fits-all answer as well for these scenarios. In particular, modeling and studies by DOE and others have estimated that it may require rapid expansion of CO2 pipelines to meet the decarbonization goals. Next slide. So we recognize that with this transport expansion comes some challenges. However, we strongly believe that these challenges aren't insurmountable. It will take the commitment of all parties to address and progress past these challenges. We are confident that regulations and standards will be updated, that project siting and permitting can be done effectively and equitably. Even though technical gaps will still be further identified, we know that working collaboratively through research, they can be resolved. Next slide. We believe this because FECM is enabling solutions through several key initiatives that you see on the screen there that are targeting the challenges mentioned. Our transport program is poised to engage communities, advance project maturity through pre-FEED and FEED studies, invest in new infrastructure construction, optimize transport network planning, and remove technical challenges through a transparent research consortium. Next slide. So I think we it was already mentioned, we recognize that the community engagement and community opposition, remains a challenge really for any type of infrastructure that's trying to be built these days. We're working very closely with our community engagement team at FECM to develop FAQs about pipelines and CO2. We're participating in community engagement summits that are happening across the country to try to answer questions to local community representatives and members. And community benefits as a consideration, as you see on the slide, is a key component of our strategy to decarbonize, really for capture, transport, and storage. It's a significant requirement to be met in all of our funding opportunity announcements. All projects funded from the application phase through award must submit plans that address the 4 items you see on the bottom right. Projects that fail to do this well may fail to gain social support, local support, and may impact deployment of future projects. Next slide. So with these pre-feed and feed studies, we're talking about advancing transport project maturity. In our pre-feed studies, we're trying to engage the industry as early as possible with project development to support advancements in infrastructure engineering and early conceptual designs needed for large-scale transport projects. With our feed studies, this is in particular is a bipartisan infrastructure law provision. We have $100 million to really accelerate and further mature these projects through the development of infrastructure, really by all modes, not just pipelines. As you can see on the right, the feed studies have some key scope that really help prepare a project for engaging with communities. For example, like when you talk about the route planning and map of the project, it would help with some of the regulatory and environmental plans that have to be developed. Will really help when engaging with state and federal regulators on the safety side, as well as any environmental reviews through NEPA that might be required. And of course, there you see the community benefits plan there as well for the requirements I mentioned on the last slide. The pre-feed studies, we put a focus in our topic to be more of an intermodal transport hub. That's a situation where we can bring in aggregated CO2 from multiple different emitters on multiple different modes of transportation, kind of into a hub where the CO2 can be collectively cleaned up to meet specifications for transport, whether it be on a pipeline out of that hub or on another mode of transportation, taking it to an area where you can then have a strategy for basin scale injection. And you can see in the bottom, you're welcome to see more about those announcements. Go ahead, next slide, please. Just a quick hit. We had 2 pre-feed studies awarded to date and 6 feed studies. Most of them are awarded. The feed studies, I think there's 1 or 2 that are a selectee but not fully awarded. Nonetheless, I have a map on the next slide, which will show the areas. But as you can see in the feed studies, we have a pretty good split between interest in pipeline as well as barge transport, moving the amounts, contingent transport amounts shown there, which are really going to have to go through the feed study to kind of get a full understanding of exactly how much is potentially could be moved through a system in a given year. Next slide, just to go to the map. So I just want to say that if you and you'll get these slides after, if you go to this page and bookmark it, there's a map that you can bring up and you can turn on and turn off all the layers. So if you turn on the transport layers, you can see where our projects are, and we'll be populating more and more over time as we go through those awards and make more awards. The 2 circles represent the pre-feed transport hubs that I mentioned before. Will be aggregating in there local and regionally. And then we have some pipeline projects there in Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and also along the Gulf Coast from Louisiana into Texas. And then you can see some of these barge projects, especially on the West Coast, a fairly significantly large one in scope there, as well as out of this Port of Tampa, where the pre-feed hub project is going on right now to bring CO2 out of the Tampa area over into Louisiana, as well as from Alabama, Mississippi into Louisiana as well, short distance project. Next slide. So the Carbon Dioxide Infrastructure Finance Innovation Program was established by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I think most of us know that. The program was authorized with 2.1 billion in appropriations. It really established a credit loan subsidy of approximately 20 billion on the loan side. This program offers both loans and future growth grants. So we'll adjust that distribution of the appropriations based on where the interest is seen, loan versus grants over time. The objective through this program is to financially enable the growth of large capacity common carrier CO2 transport infrastructure, supporting up to 80% of the of eligible project costs. And once again, this is not just a pipeline program; it's really something for each mode of transport shown there. Next slide. To participate in the program, there are some key eligibility requirements. Just to kind of speak to some of them, the project must meet all of these eligibility requirements to participate, not just one. There's just some of them, like I said. The full list of the eligibility requirements are available through the CFIA program guide, which is available to you from the CFIA program page there, from the scan and hyperlink down there. If you, as you can see, these requirements support a transport project of major significance within the carbon management value chain. Next slide. So back on May 2nd, we opened up the second half of the CFIA program dealing with the future growth grants. These grants can now be obtained if a base project meets the CFIA program eligibility requirements, and then documents how the expanded project can design to add excess, not yet contracted capacity into the transport system. So for an example, for a pipeline, this could mean adding inches to the originally planned diameter, or having a longer system by adding in laterals. As you can see from the included chart, the period closed to submit applications. We're now in a merit review process where we hope to have some announcements in 2025 of the results of those reviews. Can't really say any more since it's an active review. Next slide. So taking a step back from this slide, we had a February 2023 RD&D workshop, which primarily identified a number of key research gaps for pipelines. But one of the other key takeaways was that if we put into place a consortium would advance at-scale transport infrastructure development, technology development, and overall program overall success. It clearly fits into our strategy to remove technical barriers in unison with any interested party. It helps lower public concern over safety if we're able to resolve these knowledge gaps, therefore lowering also business risk. Consortium could establish a successful model and platform for the carbon transport research coordination across interagencies, through the federal labs, and through non-government organizations and academia. It could also facilitate a key opportunity to transfer knowledge out of the consortium to trusted community entities such as local universities and emergency responders, who can then reliably engage their local community with peer-reviewed knowledge. So these on the slide here are clearly some great benefits that we anticipate with the consortium. Most shown here would be fairly what you would expect, but this list may not be complete. We'll have to see over time. The consortium will be managed by DOE FECM with support from the National Energy Technology Laboratory. We envision those three committees shown there, each co-chaired by DOE FECM. This structure will allow us to coordinate and work together and not violate any federal government policies. Each transport mode will be represented over time as membership grows, with collated topics of interest, like you see there for pipeline. We hope to do the same for the other modes of transport, and then populate who's doing what research along those areas, so we can kind of point the public and communities to that we're working together to try to solve and resolve these gaps in knowledge, and to try to kind of lower the temperature out there that, no matter how the transport is done, it could be done safely. So last thing on this is, back on September 18th, we released a request for information. The RFI contains much more information than I'm going to talk about here. The RFI asked us several questions that we wanted to kind of hear about as we're trying to pull this consortium together, as well as offer people to provide their contact information if they wanted to join. Although the RFI closed on October 9th, we're considering other announcements, so stay tuned. That will still keep the period of opportunity to open. And really, as we establish and set up this consortium, the period, there won't be a period that will close to join. So if you want to join over time, we'll have information on a web portal ultimately on how to do that. So the next steps for us is for this RFI and any other announcements is to review the submissions that came in, kind of place people in the appropriate committee, and then start to launch the consortium through committee meetings starting in calendar 2025. Next slide. So I wanted to include this. So forward this to anyone that might be interested. Here is a link back to the pre-feed studies, the feed studies, and our CFIA program of loans and grants. The re-releasing of these opportunities will be posted there, so you'll have to go and stay tuned. And then on the bottom right, there's some more information about the consortium. And that's all I had. And when it comes to asking any questions, I'll answer them as I can. Thanks. Next slide, yeah.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I'll welcome Ryan to share his slides.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And I just want to highlight right off the bat that we're huge fans of everything DOE's doing. I really do think check out all they're doing. I really want to highlight that Connect toolkit that he mentioned in there is a fantastic. If you're trying to understand what's going on around the country, it's a very useful tool. So thank you, Bob and DOE for putting that together for us. My name is Ryan Kammer. I'm the research manager for the carbon management team here at Great Plains Institute. Off the bat, I want to apologize if my voice or if I'm coughing too much. We have young children, so we've been sick for, I don't know, about 4 years now. Next slide. If you're unfamiliar with GPI, we're an independent NGO. We focus on energy policy as well as kind of different ways to decarbonize industry. One of the areas that we work in, not the only one, but one of the ones that we do work in is carbon management, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That's the part that I'm a part of. Next slide. Now, there are a few different names or logos or initiatives that you might hear of. These are all associated with GPI. We have things like the Federal Carbon Capture Coalition. This looks to advance federal policy and works with entities like DOE and others. We also have the Industrial Innovation Initiative in a similar vein to Carbon Capture Coalition, looking at opportunities to advance policy, but specifically for decarbonizing industry. We have a wing called the Carbon Action Alliance. What this focuses on is that we really try to have that be our education and outreach and advocacy groups. We'll host our Connect event annually through the Carbon Action Alliance, which brings together people to really talk about the opportunities around education and stakeholder engagement with carbon management. And then the team that I'm most aligned with or most work most often with is the state and regional team. What we do is kind of develop a lot of analyses that are either state, regionally focused, sometimes national in scope. These are various analyses that'll be used then to kind of inform maybe some of the policy needs around different opportunities, as well as develop things like state fact sheets. We put those out annually. We try to add a few more states each year and then update the ones that we have. Really highlighting the opportunities for carbon capture in each state. Next slide. So we saw this a little bit on a few different slides from Bob, but essentially, if CO2 pipelines are new to you, they're not necessarily new to the United States. They've been around for a few decades, about 50 years or so that we've had pipelines in operation. Most of these are kind of specific to certain regions of the country that have both naturally occurring CO2 as well as opportunities to utilize that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Although certain areas like in Wyoming, we've had opportunities to capture from industrial sources, and those have certainly been around for decades as well. That being said, we have roughly 5,300 miles of CO2 pipeline operation in 2024. It's certainly a lot of mileage, but as Bob mentioned, there's still plenty that is projected need depending on how much we are utilizing carbon capture around the country as a method of decarbonization. So we've certainly seen some increase in interest in the Midwest. I know across Nebraska there's a recent project that is coming online this year, and there's certainly others that are in development. And so while some regions of the country have experience with CO2 pipelines, there's certainly some new regions that are going to be experiencing both the opportunities and challenges, as well as kind of understanding the new regulatory regime around CO2 pipelines that may not be fully developed yet in their states. Next slide. Yeah, so with that, I think one of the challenges that we often come across when talking about pipelines specifically is that oversight and jurisdiction side about what is the state's role versus the federal role, and how is it different for CO2 pipelines than might be for other pipelines. So I'll start with the safety side. There is a federal oversight of the safe construction, operation, and maintenance of CO2 pipelines. This is through the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA. Back in 1988, they were authorized by Congress to include CO2 as part of their 49 CFR Part 195, which is the side that looks at hazardous liquids, even though CO2 itself is not considered or not classified as a hazardous liquid. In the same vein, it is part of their oversight when it is transported in a supercritical state. If you're unfamiliar, it's essentially at certain pressures and temperature, the phase of the CO2 becomes in the supercritical phase, which allows it to exhibit some of the properties of liquid and gas. It has a high density. It really helps the economics and the transport of the CO2. That being said, while most oversight occurs at the federal level regarding safety, there are opportunities for the states to participate, namely through agreements with PHMSA. There's two of these. One's called the 60105 agreement, the other one's 60106. Essentially, depending on if it's an intrastate or interstate pipeline, states can go into an agreement with PHMSA to assume authority over at least oversight for intrastate pipelines, so those within their own state. To do this, they need to ensure that they have the same standards or stricter than what PHMSA currently has. They also still maintain engagement with PHMSA. They'll be reporting to PHMSA on what they are doing. There are opportunities with that agreement to apply for grants that allow PHMSA to fund up to 80% of those programs. Interstates are a little bit different in that case, you're dealing more with you're acting on behalf of PHMSA to do part of the oversight, whereas once we get into the enforcement authority, it remains with PHMSA. Another area that states can really become involved with the safety side of things is on emergency response. PHMSA offers grants for both states, but also county and other local level agencies and organizations to be able to enhance their emergency response capabilities through these grants. They're awarded annually. Excuse me. And those really allow the states to be engaged in ways beyond maybe what the operators who are involved in these individual pipelines, how they will already likely be engaged at the local level to ensure the safe operation, but also be prepared in the event of an emergency. Very different from the safety side is the siting and permitting of CO2 pipelines. There is no federal siting authority for CO2 pipelines, but the one exception would be on federal lands. In those cases, whatever agency is related to those federal lands would be involved in the siting of those pipelines. There are some challenges once you no longer have the federal authority of siting. Now you're dealing with how every state is going to interact in that, and there's a lot of variety in how they have provided authority to different agencies, whether that is at the state level. Some states like Iowa and Louisiana have state level boards and commissions who are involved in siting. Others leave that up to county, even local jurisdictions. Examples would be like Colorado, where there is no state oversight or authority that is part of the siting and permitting process. But they really leave that up to the local communities to be part of. That can certainly have challenges if you're building an interstate pipeline. You have to understand how that's different by state. We're certainly seeing right now with projects where part of the process might be approved from one state, but there's other challenges in another. They're having to engage at different levels. It's certainly not something that is not insurmountable, but it certainly presents unique challenges, I think, for CO2 pipelines. Additionally, with that, many states, even if they have excuse me, some form of authority or authorization that they've provided for siting and permitting of pipelines, it's a little bit vague on whether or not CO2 is explicitly part of that. This can include both on the siting side, but I think more importantly, we see this with is the use of eminent domain something that can be used for CO2 pipelines. There's a lot of variety there. Different states have different opinions, and we, at GPI don't necessarily, provide maybe a recommendation on which way to go, other than clarity in that for both operators and landowners to understand what that might look like. Last year, that some states have placed a moratorium on CO2 pipelines right now, and we'll get into kind of these updated rulemaking, but essentially saying we're waiting until there's some new PHMSA rulemaking before they start addressing or changing how they might allow the deployment of CO2 pipelines in their states right now. Next slide. So shifting into kind of some of the resources that we at GPI have developed recently, specifically on pipeline safety. So this summer we released about a 5 or 6 page report looking at the historical record of CO2 pipeline accidents reported by operators to PHMSA since reporting began back in 1988. So as I mentioned, 1988 is when Congress authorized PHMSA to include CO2 in their oversight authority. 1994 is the first reported accident that we see in their data. There's been about 4 accidents per year since then. But as you can see here on the right, the vast majority of these have been very small in volume. So the blue bars are the volume released and the orange bars are the total number. And as you can see, there's a few accidents that are much larger in volume released. But the number of accidents has really been associated with much smaller accidents that are kind of just beyond the thresholds of what is considered reportable to PHMSA. I guess last thing on this slide, excuse me, is I specifically talk about unintentional release versus intentional release. And actually, you can start going to the next slide for this. So essentially, unintentional release CO2 versus intentionally released. In an intentional release, back in 2010, PHMSA started separating out what needs to be or what is defined in different parts of the reports that operators provide. It essentially says, once the release is under control and that it is being released in a way that is specifically just to lower the pressure of the pipeline so that you can fix whatever the issue is. They shifted where that goes. And so the report itself largely focuses on the unintentional releases, but there certainly has been some CO2 released intentionally, but in a safe and controlled manner that does not pose a risk to the public or the environment. One of the things we saw in our analysis was that really the cause of releases, there was both a wide variety, but also not necessarily the ones that you often hear about if you are discussing the primary concerns with various stakeholders, namely corrosion. I think there's a lot of discussion around corrosion of CO2 pipelines, and that's a fair thing to be concerned about. And I think what this has really showed, what our analysis kind of showed was, I think it's so much so that that's one of the primary things that operators are focusing on is to ensure there's no water in the system that is a primary cause of leading to corrosion. Most of the failures reported that it was either equipment or a material or weld failure associated with the release. And it's hard to see in the graphic, but just like we saw in the last slide about the vast majority of them being smaller, it was the same thing here. A lot of the reports that are associated with these or the narratives describe seeing small releases where there might be a change in soil or something related to a location where they identified a problem, it was a slow leak and addressed it. That being said, there are still certainly have been large releases of CO2 related with incidents and accidents, and so that's an important area that I think PHMSA continues to advance regulations and advance safety considerations. And not only PHMSA, I think we're seeing this also with API and their proposed kind of best practices and things that we're seeing advancements as we identify issues and causes of failures. There's an advancement in how we can protect and mitigate those. Next slide. Last thing I'll cover on the safety real quick is just that the study goes further into kind of the areas and locations and the property associated with these accidents. Just of note here is that we have currently have a pretty small percentage of CO2 pipelines are identified as those that are near high consequence areas and could affect them in the event of a failure. I think as we see a change in the source of CO2 to more of an anthropogenic source of CO2, we might see that number change. An important thing to note about that is the fact that with with pipelines that are near high consequence areas, they do have an additional safety and reporting requirements that are related to those areas. Then second would be that with these accidents, we did notice that the CO2 accidents themselves had a much smaller property damage and personal damage associated with them, and also a different cause of those costs. So with hazardous liquids, much of the cost was related to things like emergency response and environmental remediation, whereas with CO2 it was largely the property damage from the owners, as well as, or sorry, from the operator's property, as well as just the value of the CO2 itself. There's more details about these in the report. Like I said, it's not too long. Hopefully it's accessible to most, about 5-6 pages, and really just kind of, we wanted to provide just here's the record of it. And we certainly think that by and large CO2 pipeline operators have done a tremendous job with pipeline safety and operation. But there have been challenges, and we encourage both operators and PHMSA to continue to ensure the safe operation. Next slide. With that, I think I'd be remiss to not mention that there was a major incident that occurred back in February of 2020. This was a rupture of a CO2 pipeline that was caused by, essentially, you had a small landslide that added weight to the pipeline itself, caused an axial strain that led to a rupture. You then had a release of about 30,000 barrels of CO2, one of the larger releases that has occurred over the last 40 years. And this with the atmospheric conditions at the time and just the way that the CO2 did not dissipate, it did lead to some serious concerns for the citizens in the area. 200 people were reported to have evacuated, with 45 seeking medical attention. So it certainly, I think, raised some concerns around the safe operation that I hope leads to some good rulemaking from PHMSA. And you can go to the next slide. Really, in response to this, as I mentioned, PHMSA initiated a new rulemaking. We hope to see those soon. There was a notice of proposed rulemaking recently, and we kind of have been expecting any day now for those to be fully released for us. But yeah, essentially they initiated a new rulemaking. They identified that we need to have a greater attention to geohazards associated with pipelines. They've initiated new research funding. So in addition to what DOE has been funding, there's been some new research that PHMSA is also funding. Both of those things have been fantastic, hopefully in advancing a greater understanding of how we can safely operate CO2 pipelines. And then they also issued a notice of probable violation to the operator. So that's all I have. I failed to add a thank you slide at the end, but if you have any questions, feel free to add or to email or Kelsey or others, or to get my email as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. And Nick, I'll hand it off to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Kelsey, and others, and thank you those that are joining in. I'm going to share a very quick run of show of a lot of activities that we're doing in support of CO2 pipelines and CCS deployment. Very much aligned to RP 1185, which is a recommended practice that trades together with agencies and NGOs and public organizations who work for 4 years, and it got unanimously approved. First and foremost, Nick Medina, Public and Stakeholder Engagement Manager for the ExxonMobil Pipeline Company. I've been with Exxon for 33 years. Right, and a big part of my career has been on engaging effectively with communities near where we have assets. And the last few years, right, well, pipelines have been kind of front and center on the need to engage more effectively. And my message to you today is going to be the core of how do we earn people's trust is engaging early, engaging effectively, and being able to be as transparent as possible about what is ahead. And for the future of energy, we don't see any other approach for doing that. All right. Let me just start by saying, for us, the core principles of 1185, openness and transparency, respect, reciprocity, inclusiveness, accessibility, equity, are very much embedded into what we do in terms of advancing projects. And it's not just CO2 pipelines, but any other kind of pipeline project out there requires that amount of openness, transparency, and adherence to 1185 core principles. We embed those into our strategies, and in the pipeline company, we call it our most wins. And one of those key, most wins that we have is amplifying our voice to educate, advocate, and engage. And a lot of what I want to be sharing today, we actually share this across industry and with DOE, DOT present on July 23rd, when we had a workshop led by API and LIPA, and DOE was there. Bob, you recall that meeting? And we shared 3 key tactics that we believe are indispensable to try to lay the groundwork that is necessary to advance some of these projects effectively. The first one is clearly training and engaging with first responders. The second one is educating all the communities where you're planning to do projects about the importance of CCS, and we'll show you an example of what we're doing with stand camps. And the third one is engaging, meaningful engagement with third parties and diverse groups, right? Our first key tactic is you have to train folks that are your first line of defense, right? And so far we have trained about 850 firefighters representing more than 200 fire departments, right, on how to respond to pipeline emergencies. We follow the book that API and LIPA and the National Association of State Fire Marshals release, right, on how to respond to pipeline emergencies. All that material is available online, and we can track which departments have completed it or not, right? And we have now worked with A&M at their TICS facility to conduct live sessions, right? We've completed 17 sessions. The 18th session is actually happening this coming weekend. We got more than 50 firefighters participating, all from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, along either existing CO2 pipelines or proposed CO2 pipelines that are projects under construction or to be in the future. We want to make sure this training goes in way before we start breaking ground, right? And I will show you that the dates for 2025 are already posted online. And rather than show you videos, which is a little bit harder when we're doing presentation like this, I'm going to put links, because this presentation was shared across industry, and you'll get a copy of it, and it will have links to a lot of good material that is available online. The main link, this is a video that we showed, right, showing testimonials of first responders and fire chief that have gone to this training, right? Take a look at it, right? Easy to click and play. You'll hear testimony from different folks. Many of these folks, after they complete the training, they go back and they post what they learn, and they become our best recruiters for the next class, right? Like I said, nearly 1,000 firefighters from along the coast region have participated in it. We make it open and available to any pipeline operator to come and observe, and we have made widely available the materials that we're using in the training, so that if any other operator wants to use the same training, just take the same presentations that we're using, the same materials, and we want to spread as much as we can on safety. There is no proprietary. We want everybody to have the materials that everybody's using, right? Great support from public officials. Here you have, for example, an image, but there is a video that you can look into the website of Commissioner Adrian Garcia in Harris County in Houston. He represents Precinct 2, which is where most of, the new work is planning to occur. That's where most of the petrochemicals, he has more pipelines probably than any other elected official in their jurisdiction. He came, he saw the TICS, and he's a big champion to try to sponsor others to come and take a look at what we're doing. Because if we don't tell our story, others will. And we've learned that the hard way. And I just wanted to tell you, for example, there's a picture right in the middle of Jack Willingham, right? He was the fire chief of the Satartia incident in 2020, right? And he started to participate, and sharing the stories that happened in Satartia, which was a regretful incident. But, we invited him to TICS, right? This is the meeting that we had on July 23rd, in which we had Undersecretary Crabtree, we had Alan Mayberry from FEMSA, we had executives from 30 other different companies, and we had more than 150 more that joined us live. Via Zoom, and we shared lessons learned from, a recent incident that occurred in the Danbury pump station near Sulphur, Louisiana. We're about sharing what we're learning, because we want at this stage to everybody know what happened, what we're planning to do to make sure that incidents like that don't ever happen again, right? We also share fact sheets. If you want to know anything about Satartia, there is a 1-page fact sheet, 2 pages that tells you what occurred. I mean, this was due to a landslide that occurred after very big rains. And yeah, some people went to the hospital, but nobody spent a night at the hospital, but there's a lot of things that we can learn because that incident was scary. But the record of CO2 pipelines in the country is phenomenal, right? And we want to make sure that we get even better. There is a fact sheet that we have also on the incident that occurred in Sulphur. I sent them to Kelsey. You'll get a copy of them. I think it's important that you guys know the facts of what this occurred because, this narrative sometimes get put out there and not necessarily using what occurred. Our emphasis is to make sure that at this stage we learn and prevent this from ever happening again. In this links, you'll get to hear from fire chief that have come to the training. James LeBlanc is from Ascension Parish. Chief Jody Herrera is from, Jefferson County, where we're doing a project, in Southeast Texas. You can also get a link to Jack Willingham. He's come to the training session that we're done, and he'll tell you this is a game changer. Listen to his video. I mean, he was in that incident in Satartia, and he now sees what they have learned and the opportunity to spread and share, what we know about CO2, that is colorless, that it is not corrosive, that, it is not flammable. And there is a way to know what to do in the event of an incident. And just knowing that information and having that kind of experience under your belt really makes everybody feel more comfortable about CO2 and everything that comes along with it. Right. The trainings for 2025 are in our website. You can go to exxonmobilpipeline.com and you can even take a look at the dates for 25. I mean, we got the one coming this weekend, and we're actually doing one on December 7th just for Southeast Texas because some of public officials have asked us to do one dedicated for them. We're more than happy to comply to make sure people are getting the training that they need. The second tactic that I'd like to share quickly is, this is a new subject for a lot of folks. Perhaps for many of us in industry, we've been doing CCS for decades, but for most people out there, it isn't. So in the lack of awareness and the lack of information, there is a lot of spread of misinformation that occurs. So we find it necessary to educate on this. And this last summer, we trained over 1,300 campers across, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, to take part in summer camps that explains what CO2 is and why is it important that we capture it instead of emit it in open air, and then we can transport it and permanently store it, right? And we actually show kids through a hands-on exercise that we did at Jackson State in Mississippi, Southern University in Baton Rouge, and at Rice University in Houston, what carbon capture and storage is all about. We bring our employees, right, and we meet with faculty and teachers from some of the schools, and we just practice and share with them about what CO2 is all about. It's a lot about communications, right? It's a lot about sharing what we know and why is it important that we get going with some of these projects from a perspective of addressing climate change, right? The students built the reservoir using very much common objects like vegetable oil representing supercritical CO2, right? And then they compete, to make sure that they can displace, right, the most vegetable oil with no leaks. And they get disqualified if there is a leak, because we know in the pipeline industry, leaks are not good. So we try to avoid them. Great exercise. If anybody wants to see how we do this, we bring our own employees, to try to see who wins in those contests. It's a very exciting opportunity. Students get to present what it's all about, right? We had an enormous amount of great feedback, either in media coverage or TV clips. Take a look at the video that we have in here. You can also go to the website and find that information. You get testimonials, not just from the kids, but from their teachers, from elected officials, from community leaders that have come and seen what it is that we're trying to do. The sessions for 2025 are already online. You can go to the Tapia Center at Rice University website and see when they're happening. As more camps are happening, we will start posting them. There is so much interest in these camps that not only are we doing in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, we're planning to do some more in the Midwest this coming summer. And University of Calgary is interested for us to come and bring the Tapia Center to Canada. We're going to run some camps in Canada, probably in 2025 as well. Right. The third tactic that I'd like to share is we need to meet the communities where we're planning to do these projects. And as we know, many of the communities, in which new projects will happen will be diverse groups, and in Houston alone, 80% of the folks that live near many of these assets will be Black and brown. So it is incumbent upon us to share with them. That means meeting with these folks, whether it is at community events or whether it is to SCEM camps. It is important. And together with API and LIPA, we've hosted meetings with NAACP in Houston. I'm bringing pipeline leadership to go meet with, the community leaders where we have assets. It's important that we do that, because otherwise they're going to feel like they don't know what's coming, and then there'll be resistance to it. And we need to anticipate resistance. So partnering with folks like John Holk of HARC is absolutely essential so we can get our narrative out. At the end, it's about educate, advocate, and get involved. If you have any questions, just go to our website. A lot of information in there. We even have projects website. This is the Texas Gulf Coast ExxonMobil pipeline site. Go to that page, click on resources. There's over 100 videos, different testimonials from fire chiefs from across the Gulf Coast, or STEM teachers or students that have participated in our programs, right? There is infographics of what pipeline construction is about, what CO2 is about. There is a wealth of information, and we make this all widely publicly available so that we can learn more about what's coming and what's ahead. I know Kelsey will send a copy of that, but that's a bit of what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much for the great informative presentation, Nick, and all of you. I think for the remaining 10 minutes or so, we'll have time for Q&A. So please continue to put any questions you have in the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. But maybe I'll start with one question that came in, and I'll open the floor to any of you who may feel comfortable answering this. But there was some interest in knowing a little bit more about kind of the oversight process of CO2 pipelines versus hydrogen pipelines. Are there similar challenges you're seeing and concerns? And are there any resources you could direct the states to?
I'll take a shot at it. CO2 pipelines are regulated by DOT rules 195 liquids, right? When they are liquids and when they are gas, and that will be the case of hydrogen, it will be 192, right? If you go through 192 and 195 in the code, right, very particular kind of requirements. There is dozens and dozens of requirements that takes place in order to build a liquid pipeline or a natural or a gas pipeline, right? PHMSA is definitely addressing 195 for CO2, right? But there is an element of, CO2 pipelines that are in gas, and my understanding is that they're trying to incorporate that as well in the same, right? Pipelines are highly regulated, highly codified in what you're supposed to do. Now, can we always get better? Absolutely. But it also takes a monumental effort from industry to make sure that we self-impose a higher standard. Because at the end of the day, we'll always be judged by the lowest common denominator. So what we do together, as industry, to raise all boats, to elevate our performance is absolutely critical. If you want to see the performance of industry, comparing liquids and gas and CO2 pipelines, that's one effort in which API and LIPA have really come, in a good way to show that, for example, the numbers prove it. CO2 pipelines from an incident perspective have a better record than in liquids or gas pipelines. Can we do better? Absolutely. And we're looking forward to seeing what PHMSA is going to come about, but we're sure that this is going to be a step in the right direction to further elevate that level of standard.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'm not a hydrogen pipeline expert by any means, but I think there probably is going to be a difference in as far as our deployment. I think there is a difference in the ability for maybe hydrogen to access some of the natural gas pipeline system. At times, there's certainly research going on about the ability to blend it within the system. There seems to be differences in maybe capabilities depending on how the pipeline's been built. There's certainly added challenges like embrittlement that can occur with hydrogen that needs to be considered, and some other things. But that might be certainly one of the advantages maybe for the hydrogen side is as there's an ability to incorporate it into the current system, there might be some better opportunities. CO2, for the most part, is more challenging to do a conversion of service from natural gas pipelines. They typically have not been constructed to handle the same requirements that CO2 does, largely with the pressure, but other challenges as well. And so we're seeing it, and we might see some conversion of gas pipelines to CO2, but I think that it might be more limited. But yeah, as far as kind of the deployment, I think the other large difference might be in the ability of the hydrogen to be considered more of a commodity than maybe CO2 traditionally is. Now, certainly, a lot of the deployment so far has been also from a specific source, say say a natural dome, to some specific sinks. And so I think we're seeing some changes in how operators are considering deploying pipelines now. It's maybe not just a single source to sink, but might be pulling in 15, 20, and how that changes how they deploy as well will be interesting. But yeah, so I think there's certainly some similarities, but that difference in use of the end use of the two, as well as their integration to existing systems is pretty different.
If I may add, Kelsey, I think is timely that, you know, we hear a lot about CO2 pipelines and a lot of good effort is being done as we're starting to hear more about hydrogen pipelines, and there's a lot less mileage on hydrogen that there is on CO2. It is really incumbent that, you know, the educate, advocate, and working with first responders become front and center, right? I know that together with NAS from the National Association of Fire Marshals and Texas A&M, we're going to be updating our training that we do with firefighters to include hydrogen, how to respond to hydrogen emergencies on pipelines or any other kind of facility. That should be ready by end of next year. There is already a good amount of information, but I mean, there are some challenges with hydrogen that the earlier that we train the first folks that will be there, the better, right? And so that eliminates also the sometimes, you know, not knowing, you know, is that uncertainty that makes people afraid. We need to reach out early, engage with communities, explain them what it is, what the opportunities to having hydrogen out there is, right? So that we eliminate the amount of resistance that comes from not knowing what is there, right? And it's not just hydrogen, it's also everything else that comes with hydrogen. There will be ammonia pipelines down the road. So the earlier that we can educate, the earlier that we can train first responders about all of that, I think the better that we will be in getting the kind of acceptance that is needed from folks so that they're feeling more comfortable about what we're doing ahead.
Appreciate that perspective, Nick, and something we may want to elevate in our clean hydrogen state working group that we have for the state energy offices. But there was one quick question, Robert, that came in about the consortium you mentioned, and I know there's a website and more information coming soon, but are there any ways that state energy offices and state governments can engage, or have you already reached out to state governments to participate?
Absolutely, they can engage. You know, I mentioned 3 committees. One's for federal agencies only, not state. One's for the national laboratory network in the country. And then the non-government one, even though it says non-government one, that's where the state agencies could play. And that would be an opportunity for us to coordinate, you know, who's doing what gaps still remain, and kind of collate that information on that portal that I mentioned that we're thinking of developing. But also, you know, to engage with states once we start having some results. I mentioned first responders, more local than perhaps states, but we can engage with any of the right appropriate end users once we have knowledge coming out of the research that we're funding, that PHMSA is funding or industry is funding, and try to build synergies with states and other organizations.
That would be great. Thank you. Yeah, so maybe a question on some of the kind of equity and economic development considerations. As most of you know on the line, state energy offices, they're really well positioned to bring different stakeholders together, do community outreach, and provide educational materials. And so really thinking about how states can best address concerns for communities and maybe emphasize some potential benefits. Are there any sort of economic development or workforce opportunities you've seen associated with CO2 pipelines that states may be able to reference when doing some of this community outreach?
Yeah, when it comes to carbon management in general, so that's capture, transport, and storage. DOE FECM has worked pretty closely with one of the main labor organizations, the United Association, and that covers a wide range of skill sets and infrastructure that could be worked on. And in those programs, we've heard of opportunities very similar to what Nick mentioned, but getting into a high school level, bringing people that entering into programs to become tradesmen in those or tradespersons in those areas. There's scholarships and other things that that organization is doing, and they're really trying to place people kind of into the industries that are going to be needed to have such a workforce developed. We talked about building out such infrastructure on my slides, on Ryan's slides, and without a workforce to do that and a trained workforce, it's going to be very difficult to do so because there's still thousands of miles of natural gas and oil petroleum systems that need to be constructed. So who's going to build all this infrastructure, both on the well, not both, but on the capture, transport, and storage side?
Yeah, I would add, Kelsey, that, local economic benefits is not new to CO2 pipelines. I mean, pipeline construction in general, right, generates a great deal of jobs, and developing community, plans that identify those opportunities and try to make sure that some benefits stay locally, and you hire local folks, and diverse folks, and trade folks, right? It's something that has been done for all pipeline projects for quite a while. But I do think that for these emerging fuels, there is a greater need to make sure that we go ahead of those, that we show the benefit, the jobs that will be coming, and that we work with schools and academics in order for them to also elevate the discussion to show the local economic benefit plan and how that can be done. Right. I think a number of pipeline operators that have done pipeline projects over the last 10 years, we have learned the hard way. We have to show benefits in order to convince the local communities why they should allow us to have the privilege to put a pipeline in their backyard, in the farm, in their park, or something like that. I think that just gets elevated, 2-3 times more with the emerging fuels, right? And it becomes what has worked in the past. Let's make sure that we do it again to these new projects, and also include all the folks that need to be part of that discussion. From an industry perspective, we have to leverage different voices, right? And I mean, we have to leverage folks that are working on the ground, contractors that, help them make sure that they hire folks locally, right? I think we need to make sure that, some of the benefits stay together. I mean, there are requirements, in some of these projects that you need to meet Justice 40% of the benefits stay with the underserved communities that are around. I mean, it's very clear what is necessary. Early engagement, early work to make sure that you do that homework makes the work later a lot easier to get the acceptance that is necessary. Otherwise, operators run the risk of getting their projects opposed, and permits delayed, and court action that can only increase the overall cost, and that doesn't help. So, I mean, the message that I made at the very beginning, consistent with RP 1185, which is all about public engagement, and it was not just industry, but together with NGOs and together with, even PHMSA and FERC participated in it, and other members of the public. That's the kind of engagement that we want to do.
Yeah. And if I could further Nick's response, just about everything that Nick said is something I mentioned in the requirements for the community benefits plan. So, operators are really trying to satisfy a social license to operate is really what he's talking about. And to kind of pull this information together in our feed studies will help project mature and be very ready for those type of things when they engage with communities, both in the feed studies, even though it's really a fictitious project. It's not a real project until after feed, if it's a go. What states can do is, I believe, follow along where either the capture, storage, or transport projects are across the country. They can drill down and click on that and then go to the project page, contact the people running the projects that we're awarding, and try to stay close with them to find out how those endeavors, many of which Nick mentioned, are going, and be ready to then partner, potentially not partner, but be ready to have a very frequent and constructive dialogue with those potential operators and developers as they bring those mature projects to bear.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the helpful responses and information. I know we could continue this conversation for much longer, but I see we're at time. So with that, I'll thank Nick, Bob, and Ryan for your time, and for everyone on the line. Be on the lookout for the slides, recording, and other materials. And I'm sure our speakers today would be happy to answer any questions you all have over email if you'd like to follow up. So with that, thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.